Thank you, everyone. We're going to get started here. Welcome, and again, thank you for coming. The purpose of this panel is to provide you with a guide on how to handle hacked and leaked data sets. My name is Gerard Ryle. I'm the director of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And from having worked on projects like the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers, it's clear to me that one of the main challenges of investigative journalism these days has actually changed. It used to be very difficult to get information. Now it seems that one of the main challenges is making sense of large amounts of information. Hackers and whistleblowers now routinely make off with terabytes of data, often sensitive data from governments, from corporations, and from financial intermediaries. These data sets are gold mines of potential public interest information, but they also present new ethical, legal, and logistical challenges. Just recently, a whistleblower brought me into a room on the dark web. And in this room, there were logos of some of the biggest corporations in the world. And attached to each logo was a clock, and the clock was counting down. And also attached to each logo, there was a message. I want to read a typical message because I think it sets up very nicely the discussion we're about to have. I will read it in full, it's quite short. We have been on your network for a long time and have analyzed your business. We have stolen over 2 terabytes of your sensitive data. We have personal data, documents, and photos of your customers and employees, financial records, non-disclosure transactions, and much more. If you ignore or refuse to do business with us, we will be forced to make all of your data public. Our blog is being followed by many high-profile media outlets. The case will be highly publicized and will cause devastating damage to your business. The only way to avoid this is to make a deal with us. Now, to help us negotiate these new challenges and opportunities for journalism, we are lucky to have 3 of the world's experts on this topic. To my immediate left is Micah Lee. He is a director of information security at Intercept. He is a security engineer and an open source software developer who writes about technical topics, leaked data sets, and the far right. He's also the author of a new book that teaches journalists, researchers, and activists how to download, research, and analyze and report on data sets. Juliette Garside is one of the world's leading investigative journalists. She is the deputy business editor at The Guardian, responsible for news and financial investigations. Juliette was previously a member of The Guardian's investigations team, specializing in tax and offshore investigations. Alexander Papachristou is the executive director of the Vance Center for International Justice, where he leads the Good Governance program. Alex is the kind of lawyer every journalist likes because, to borrow his own joke, he comes at the right price. He provides free legal representation to anti-corruption and investigative journalism organizations worldwide. Micah, I'm going to start with you. Why is there suddenly so much data out there? What does it look like, and where can we find it?
Thank you. Hello. So this is a good question. I started doing investigative journalism about 10 years ago, and the very first data set that I worked on was the Snowden archive. And back then, data sets like that. Much better. Okay, sorry. I started working on journalism about 10 years ago, and the first data set that I worked on was the Snowden archive. And back then, data sets like that were incredibly rare. Had only been a few, large data sets with, a lot of documents, a lot of data, like the leaks from Chelsea Manning, the Iraq and Afghanistan logs, and the diplomatic cables. But it was very rare, and now that's completely changed. The situation is there's enormous data sets of that magnitude, not necessarily, with that many revelations, but sometimes, dumped on the internet pretty much every day, and we're kind of drowning in data. It's like long past the time where sources would have to, take some physical documents out of their office and then spend hours at a photocopier making copies and then mailing them to newsrooms. And so now it's just the technology is so far advanced that this is only increasing, and we can see it just like every year. It's more and more and more. And I feel like a big example of this is right when Russia invaded Ukraine, the floodgates kind of opened with hackers hacking Russian targets. And there was dozens of Russian government agencies and corporations from all different industries that were hacked with terabytes and terabytes of data and like huge email dumps, to the point where it was just kind of overwhelming to figure out how to even handle all of this. So where do you find this sort of data set? There's a lot of places, and I think that one of the best sources is distributed denial of secrets, or DDoS secrets. This is kind of like a public library of data sets that they curate specifically for journalists. There's a collection of public data sets that anyone can download, but there's also private data sets that you need to request access if you're a journalist, because they contain like personal information of lots of people. And so this is a great source for getting data sets, but it's definitely not the only source at all. And in fact, they just get data sets like, directly from people sending it to them, and also they look at like these sometimes ransomware websites, or sometimes hacktivist Telegram channels and stuff. And so you can go directly to those sources too. And yeah, like there's data everywhere. I think a big source of data is hackers. So the two main places, the two main types of hackers are hacktivists. Like that, it seems like, it's, all of this is very murky. It's really hard to tell when it's a hacktivist or when it's actually, some nation state pretending to be hacktivists. But like all of those Russian hacks, there was a series of different hacktivist groups that were taking credit for those, and they were just dumping things directly on the internet or putting things in their Telegram channels, and then some of them were just sending things directly to distributed denial of secrets. But then also, if you have if you are in a newsroom that has a reputation for doing this sort of data, or you're just a journalist that has a reputation for this, you might get sources who are hackers who hack something and then send you data privately. This has happened with me a few times. And then there's also, public records. A lot of times there's really interesting stuff in public records, and those data sets can be enormous. And then there's just public data in general on websites. So a good example is, in the United States, there is a group called the Anti-Defamation League. It's a nonprofit Jewish group that works on documenting anti-Semitic hate. But recently they've, been very kind of hostile to progressive people, and after October 7th, after the Hamas attack, they, like a month or two after, they published an interactive map of the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel rallies in the United States. And it was basically just like a data visualization of a map, and you can like move your mouse over all of the states and see all the different categories of anti-Semitic incidents. And so I just wrote a little bit of code to go and extract all of the data from this data visualization, and I ended up with a spreadsheet. And then I looked through all of this data, and it included way more than was just on the map. They had like little descriptions of each thing. And I found out that like a sizable portion of this were like ceasefire protests organized by American Jewish groups, essentially protesting genocide. And they were like framed as anti-Semitic incidents. And so that was an example of where the data is out there. The data is everywhere. And so, yeah.
We'll might come back to some of these state actors actually later on. Juliette, I just want to move on to you. So The Guardian was one of the media partners on an ICIJ collaboration last year called Cyprus Confidential. Now, this involved reporting on hacked data, some of it involving previous ransom demands. Take us through that project, and what were the issues that the 270 journalists who worked on the project faced?
Thank you. Yes, so Cyprus Confidential was probably what I spent most of last year working on in terms of investigations outside of my daily news job. And it was really the culmination of a piece of reporting that began, I think, for both of us separately at that point in about December 2021, when some information was hacked and shared with various organizations, including The Guardian, from an offshore services provider in Cyprus. When we think of offshore, we think probably of the British Virgin Islands or the Cayman Islands, but Cyprus is a tax haven in the heart of Europe. It's an EU member state, and it has, for the last 20, 30 years, been the gateway for Russian money into Europe. So the kind of people whose information we were examining suddenly became of enormous public interest. People like Roman Abramovich, Alexei Mordashov, who's a Russian industrialist and the country's richest man, according to Forbes. People like Konstantin Malofeev, a sort of mini-gark, I guess I would describe him as, who was very involved in promoting pro-Russia militia in 2014 around the invasion of Crimea, and in the years afterwards when his associates became governors and military leaders in the region, in the breakaway regions of Ukraine. So people of high interest. Now, yes, we were dealing with hacked material. We had to process it initially, and the database was growing. I think it grew to about 3.5 million files in the end. And so we had to dedicate an increasing number of reporters and programmers and to working on it, and the group came together, led by the ICIJ, halfway through the year, and I think we ended up with about 6 different offshore service providers from Cyprus. And so we faced a legal threat at one point from one of the offshore service providers, complaining that their data had been hacked and sharing information actually with us about what the it was a ransomware attack, sharing information and quotes actually from the hackers, some of which I think you've just read out. We had legal letters saying from 2 of the providers saying that they'd been the subject of ransomware attacks actually. So the legal threat was of action in Cyprus, and we had to decide whether to go ahead and publish. We had a very short window of, I think it was about 4 weeks, where we faced a potential injunction in Cyprus. So not legal action in the UK or the US, but inside Cyprus. And we had to decide whether we were going to go ahead and publish before that date, and how we could mitigate that situation in terms of legal risk. In the end, it was fine. There was no further legal action. But yeah, I just wanted to say, do you want to say a bit about the importance of the stories?
Well, I guess the audience might want to know how you dealt with the threat of being scooped. Yeah. Because this information was already publicly available, and here you were devoting months of your time working on it. How did you get around that?
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to know that what we're about to publish is in the public interest, and we will defend our reporting, we'll be able to defend it in court on that basis. But it's actually also really important to show, when there's been a breach of the law, so in the UK we have laws against computer misuse, for example, and that covers hacking, you have to show that the material you're about to publish also points to potential breaches of the law. So the bar for publishing becomes higher when when there's been a hack. And when there's been data theft. In fact, we had to look pretty hard. We had to examine what we had and nail down the fact that we thought there had been a criminal breach. So that was part of it. One of the instances was a sanctions breach. So the great thing about this data is it showed not only what happened over the last 30 years, but what happened in the weeks and months before and after the invasion, as oligarchs scrambled to shield their money from asset freezes and sanctions. Now in Cyprus, avoiding sanctions is actually a criminal offence. And we found evidence, and this hasn't been proved in a court of law, but we found evidence pointing to the fact that PwC, the Big Four accounting firm, had worked hard to try and help the owner of a big listed company in Germany, a Russian oligarch, move his shares into his wife's name to avoid an asset freeze. Now, knowingly doing this after sanctions had been imposed would be a criminal breach. So that helped. The other thing that helped enormously was good legal advice, and for which we very much have the ICIJ and Alex to thank. So we gathered together on a call and we decided that whatever we did, we would do together. And so the lead partners discussed it and decided to go ahead and publish.
Great, thank you. I might come back again, though, on the scoop, but let's go on to Alex. Alex, Bob Woodward of Watergate fame, everyone would know him, once told me that a journalist should never turn down information. But are journalists who report on hacked data aiding a crime?
Hello, everyone. I will avoid the yes or no question. And first, as a lawyer, I must say that I can't be giving you all legal advice here, but I'd be happy to consider giving you that advice individually, separately later on. So I'm just giving you legal information. I think we can look at investigative journalism in this context as finding your meal for the day. So traditionally, investigative journalists would go out and hunt for their food, and they would publish what they killed. They would find sources, and they would seek out nutrition in those sources, and they would publish. Hacked data, it's sort of like takeout food. Somebody shows up at your office or your house with a lot of data that deliverer presumably has prepared himself or herself, and there is your meal. The dark web to me seems more like a school cafeteria, where you go in with your tray and it's filled up with whatever is on the menu that day. You don't really get to see it, even know what it is. It's all pretty indistinguishable. It's gray, it's brown, it's mushy. And the problem with that from a legal perspective is that on that tray can be something that is illegal for you to have. Like, that your school tray could have cocaine on it, and there you are sitting down at your table, and the cops come and they bust you. Now, in this context, it's not going to be cocaine, but it could be child pornography, for example, the possession of which on your computer is a crime in many places. And if you get a leaked data set on the dark web, it could have that. It could have secret government documents. And in the United States, there are certain documents, the possession of which is a crime. So I've had clients who've had to quickly find ways to get these documents out of their servers because we had advice that those documents were incriminating to possess. Forget about publishing it, you couldn't have it. And other clients have gotten data sets that included not only lots of information about organized crime, but did include child pornography. And they had frantically and furiously had to go through all of those data and delete the child pornography. So there are real legal risks with venturing into the dark web where someone else is preparing the meal. As Micah said, it might be not even food on your tray, or it might be fake food. A lot, you eat with caution. And you might see something that looks really delicious on the floor of the cafeteria, and do you pick it up and eat it? Probably not, right? And so those are sort of the considerations, I think, if I may, by metaphor, offer for the nutritional needs of investigative journalism.
No, thank you. Look, clearly some of these hackers want to get paid. Micah, would you pay for this data if it was good enough?
So during all of the time that I've worked at the Intercept, we've never paid a source for data. We do. I think that, like most journalists, we do pay for data sometimes. Like you have to pay for processing fees for public records or services like LexisNexis or like historical Whois data or things like that. But in terms of like hacked data, I think that it's very ethically fraught to consider paying for it. And I also think that for the most part, it's not necessary just because there's so much data out there that is just completely publicly available already without paying for it. I think that there might be exceptions that you have to like carefully consider. And the example that comes to mind is Bellingcat when they were investigating Alexei Navalny's FSB assassins. They got some cellular data from like black markets in Russia from, I guess, people who worked at the telecoms who weren't allowed to share this data, but they had access to it, and they paid for it. And this helped them track down specific FSB agents that were like stalking Navalny. And so in a case like that, yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to talk to lawyers and to decide like, is this okay for us to pay for this data to move forward with this investigation? So there might be like very specific pieces of data that you can pay for that might be really helpful, but for the most part, for just like data sets, yeah, I don't know. I don't think that, I think that you should avoid it most of the time.
Fair enough. Juliette, The Guardian itself was actually one of the firms that was famously hacked and held to ransom. What was that period like for you and your colleagues, and how has that incident affected the thinking by the leaders in your newsroom?
Yeah, how was it? It was triggering. We had just come out of a series of lockdowns, and in December 2021, we got a message from the office saying, you can't come in. You've got to stay home. There's been a hack. Your work computers have to be debugged. We're going to have problems getting the paper out. And you're going to have to work from home. We don't know how long it's going to last. It lasted 3 months. So I was back at my kitchen table for another 3 months. At least we weren't wearing masks at that point. So they got in, we think probably via payroll or advertising. Those were two of the systems that were affected. That meant, you know, I know what it's like to be the subject of one of these ransomware attacks. I don't know if it was a ransomware attack. We never disclosed who did it or why, but I mean, it took the shape of that because they took employee data and they threatened to release it on the web. In the end, I don't think, if it was released, I don't think it was anyone made any nefarious uses of it. In some cases that does happen and people end up having bank accounts opened in their names, so there was that worry. We had to downpage the newspaper. The systems that we used to place ads in the print product didn't work, so I think we either had no ads or very few for a while. And that was really dispiriting for a team that's anyway, you know, the small team that puts together the print product is already is stretched because that's a declining part of what we do. At one point, they were having to email pages to each other because the system that shared the pages was broken and edit each story on a page one by one in turn. It was horrifically laborious. We cut the number of editions as well. But I just wanted to say, I mean, just really clearly, there is a war in Ukraine, but there are two other parallel wars. There is a financial war, which the West has unleashed on Russia and its allies, and there is this cyber war. And the number of hacks in the UK, we were just one. You know, you'll have seen it across your organisations and you know, among people you know who go to the office in countries around the world. The UK, the number of ransomware attacks went from something like 100 in 2019 to 800 last year. You know, these are being carried out by ransomware, but ransomware is just a fig leaf. These are partisan attacks, and the relationship between the hackers and, say, the Russian state is porous and is used by the Russian state to put forward its own agenda and target quite critical targets, such as our newspaper.
But did it affect psychologically, do you think, your leaders not wanting to get involved in reporting on this kind of data because they were so burnt by it?
No, I mean, I think the day before we were sent home, I'd just published an investigation into an oligarch close to Putin, and the use of public funds, it looks like, to buy a yacht, which he then gave to Putin. We published just before, and we carried on publishing after, and that's what Cyprus Confidential was. I mean, our Russia correspondent obviously had to leave. I'm glad they did after what happened to Evan Gershowitz, who still remains in prison in Russia. And so on the ground, we had to change what we did. But in terms of dealing with this kind of data, in fact, this has been a golden time, not only because there is more of this data, but the UK government has finally introduced protections for journalists. We have a very hostile climate for journalism in the UK, and they've now made it illegal for anyone who's currently on the sanctions list to sue for libel. So those people we were writing about, like Abramovich, Molotov, didn't have recourse to the UK courts, and they had been suing journalists pretty actively before the full-scale invasion. So no, it's been a golden time for us on this kind of work.
Yeah. Alex, from a legal point of view, how different is this hacked data from, say, material given to journalists traditionally from inside a firm by, say, a disgruntled employee?
Well, I don't know, strictly speaking, legally, it obviously would depend on the nature of the data. That's always the lawyer's slithery response, it depends. Obviously, the principal legal justification for investigative journalism is serving the public interest. You can publish government secrets even though you weren't supposed to have them in the United States and in other jurisdictions, proving that what you did, what you published, served the public interest will save you from a defamation suit in London or in Switzerland, where I just was viewing a defamation case. In Canada, they have a different name for it. But when you think about your job as serving the public interest, you're in some sense protecting the public, serving the public. And it's the public who suffer from ransomware attacks or hacks. But you as the journalist see a higher interest than the individual person's loss of data. And you screen out the personal private information and don't publish it, unless of course it really does serve the public interest to publish it. The problem with ransomware data is that, first of all, it's been already commercialized. The people who stole it did so to make money. Now that may be the case with a regular old hacker, but usually those hackers are exercising a grudge they have against an employer, or trying to disclose horrible things that are happening in the company or the government. But ransomware, it's purely commercial. And you really have to ask, encouraging them by using their data provides them with a secondary market. The primary market is to blackmail the original owner of the data and get money. They fail with that, so then they put it on the dark web. And when it gets used, that's the secondary market. They don't get money, but they get leverage over the next person whose data they hack, and the next ransomware victim. So you have to feel that you are in some sense participating in this market activity, giving these data value, monetary or reputational or whatever it is. And so there I think you really have to tread more carefully with the dark web data from a legal or ethical perspective than you might with the traditional hack data.
Look, I'm sure everyone here has loads of questions, so I'm going to leave some time at the end for that. So if you have some, please get them ready, and we'll try and leave about 10 minutes at the end. Practical questions here. Micah, some of these data sets are massive, right? Take us through the challenges that you face when you encounter them first, and can just any journalist do this work?
So it can be very difficult to, even just download a massive data set, much less actually work with it. It definitely requires special training. You need to know how to use different tools. Sometimes you need to know how to program. I do think that anyone who is really motivated and has the time can learn to get good at this stuff. And so actually, the book that I just wrote, Hacks, Leaks, and Revelations, that's the goal of it, is to teach everybody to do this because there's way too much data and there's not enough journalists that have these skills. Oh, and also, I recently learned that there's an Italian edition of the book that comes out in May. The publisher is Apogeo, an Italian publisher, so that's exciting. But yeah, so the first challenge is just downloading it, and so it depends on where you get it. It could sometimes take days or weeks to download hundreds of gigabytes from a Tor Onion service. And so you can't just do that on your laptop. You oftentimes have to set up a server that's on 24 hours to download it, and then maybe there's like interruptions in the connections. You have to make sure it automatically resumes, and sometimes you have to figure out how to download lots of data from a Telegram channel. And all of this could just be challenging in itself. But then once you actually have it, then depending on the type of data set, you don't even, like a lot of times you can't even tell if a data set is useful or interesting or has any revelations in it at all until you download it and can look at it. So once you have it, you can start looking at it and figuring out what type of data is and how you deal with it really completely depends on the type of data. Like if it's an SQL database dump, then you have to set up a SQL server and import it. And if it's like an email dump, it depends on the format of email and you have to find ways of, you might import it all into Thunderbird, or if it's a big collection of, Office documents, sometimes hundreds of gigabytes of Office documents, you can use software like Aleph to index it all, but you have to set up a server to do this. So it could all be very challenging. And then sometimes, so an example is, I had access to a data set from Celebrate, which is a phones forensics company that is able to take phones. Law enforcement all over uses it to extract data from phones and sometimes get past lock screens and things like that. But the data set was basically just a single backup file in some proprietary Microsoft format of their source code, and it was an old version of this software, and I spent a while at it, and I couldn't figure out how to restore the backup to access the actual data, and I ended up giving up because it was just taking too long. And so I think that there's stuff like that. Those are the types of problems that you'll face. But then once you actually have that, then there's another major problem, which is how do you authenticate that this data is real? How do you actually start searching it and finding the stories? And so an example is, a hacker reached out to me and sent me a bunch of data from this far-right anti-vaccine group called America's Frontline Doctors. This was in 2021, in the middle of the pandemic. And basically, America's Frontline Doctors set up this kind of scam telehealth situation where they would convince people not to get vaccinated, and then they would try and sell people ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And the hacker sent me patient records, hundreds of thousands of patient records. And basically with this, and subscription records also, I was able to basically calculate how much revenue they made with this thing, and they made millions and millions of dollars off of this. But in order to authenticate that it was real, I basically had a list of patients, and I had their email addresses, and since I knew that this was a kind of Trump-associated group and it was, very right-wing, I also had this other data set from Gab, which is this far-right social network, and I had thousands of email addresses from that. So I just took a list of email addresses from the America's Frontline Doctors data and email addresses from Gab and looked for emails in common, and I found several, and then I just started looking through the Gab profiles of all of these America's Frontline Doctors patients, and I found several of them where they started talking about, being America's Frontline Doctors patients and finally getting hydroxychloroquine and stuff like that. So that's what you have to go through to
basically a lot of work at the beginning. Juliette, so because the sheer scale, I guess, of information that you're dealing with here, are journalists actually missing big stories, big opportunities?
Yeah, there's so much out there that we haven't looked at, and you and I have had that discussion in the past few weeks. And I think we need to think about how we do it. I mean, this kind of work is incredibly resource intensive, and I'm having to pull journalists on my team off daily reporting to spend time on it. And you're reluctant to do that until you know that there's a story there, that there's some kind of story there. But how do you begin examining the data? You need resource to find out if there's a story there, because a lot of the time, because this data isn't coming from someone who works at a company who has uncovered something that they are really worried about, and they're coming to you and explaining what it is they're worried about. That's the traditional way these things happen, and you would know what the story was right from the get-go. In this case, it's not as clear. And Gerard, you've dealt with that situation many times over the years with these kind of leaks, and you do need to initially examine the data. Then, I mean, just to sort of talk you through what we have to do as a team before we can handle these data sets, we have to put our legal goggles on. We have to imagine what it would be like if I was a judge looking at what The Guardian had done with this material. And that's essentially what we need to do to process a lot of this. So we need to initially look at it, scope it, see if there's anything in the public interest. If there is, we need to make a note of what that is. And then we can build up the resource and devote more reporters to that. But I think initially we need to just put together a list of what is out there, why we think it's interesting, and then have a few canny reporters looking at it, picking out what we think is going to be important, and then putting together some projects. And I think that scoping exercise in itself is something we haven't done yet. I don't know if the ICIJ is going to have a think about that, but we need to do it. I'm keen to do that.
And is there like some scope here for the use of AI in automating some of this, do you think?
That's a really interesting thought. Potentially. I mean, somebody writing a comment piece in The Guardian the other day said the problem with AI is it's a bit like mansplaining. It's often wrong and always very, very confident in in its assertions. So it's only a tool, isn't it? You need a careful tooth comb. I mean, to be honest, yes, I think there is a role. We use blunt techniques on data sets like cross-matching, lists of emails, lists of parliamentarians with the data, and then it comes up with a list that most of that's gobbledygook and not of interest, but you go through it and you pick out the things that are, and it's just one way of cracking it open, and I think you can use AI in similar ways. We haven't done it yet, but I think we probably should look at that.
Yeah. Alex, I guess most people still remember Julian Assange and WikiLeaks because they were the first big organization to really get the big leaks. He clearly made some mistakes. Are you able to walk some of these journalists through how to avoid the pitfalls that he fell into or that organization fell into?
Not really, but I'll try. I have not followed the case closely. Many people have, of course, and they are passionate one way or the other to the extremes. And I don't really want to venture into that with what I say. But I would note that there were two indictments, two sets of charges brought against him, as I understand it. Someone may correct me on that, please. And the reason for the second was really to make the case even harder against him, even more aggressive against him. And those allegations in the second indictment focused very much on what he supposedly, allegedly instructed or suggested that Chelsea Manning do in order not to be caught leaking the data to WikiLeaks. And so I think from a legal point of view, that's what he did wrong. He told the source how to avoid being detected. Now, we should pause and say, well, isn't that what investigative journalists always do? Even when they were out hunting for their stories in the wilderness, they were saying to sources, no, don't send that to me by email, use Signal. Or I'll meet you in this place outside where nobody can be eavesdropping us, and you can tell me everything. And so by the logic of this second indictment, isn't that also telling the source how to leak the information secretly? So I guess probably what he did wrong was to piss people off by being just the personality he is. And I don't mean by that to say I agree with that judgment. As I say, I'm not going there. But to be an early participant in this maelstrom of leaking and hacking and ransomwaring, and then to have that sort of in-your-face attitude may have been really what he did wrong, and I don't think one should blame him for that.
Sure, but I guess people need to be careful in their initial correspondence because it may be.
Do you pay a source to come and meet with you when the source says, I can't afford to make it to the meeting? Do you tell the source how to take the data from the device and put it on a stick or whatever, what program to use? It's tricky stuff, and I certainly think that in just about any country, if the government wanted to make charges on the basis of anything that an investigative journalist does, it could probably get away with it. The law is pretty malleable and harsh.
Okay, thank you.
I've also been told to always be very careful about when you're talking to a source about doing things that could be construed as conspiring with them. So specifically asking for more information. So if they give you a bunch of data and you're like, oh, this is really interesting, but what I would really like is this other data, and then they go back into the system they still have access to and get that other data, that could get you in a lot of trouble.
Oh, that's right. There's an important, I think it's a Supreme Court case in the United States, where the journalist wanted the source to authenticate the original data and said, please go back and get me this that will prove that the original information you gave me is true. And that was the illegal act, the asking for confirmation. So what you think is good practice to get your information authenticated or corroborated ends up being what gets you incarcerated.
Great. Questions from the audience? I think we have a microphone somewhere. Please direct them to any of our guests. Please state your name too at the beginning. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Daniel, and the question I have is for Alex, I believe.
Yes, Alex.
Yes, so...
Good to see you, Daniel. We couldn't see anybody before. This is really weird talking to darkness, the dark web.
So the question is, at least in the context for the US, where does First Amendment come in? When talking about leaking data and protecting yourself against any government reprisals, how can you use First Amendment to basically take a stand on your actions and what you did?
So if you're the journalist, the First Amendment is a beautiful thing. It's what allows you to publish information that you obtained from somebody who gave it to you illegally. And that takes us back to the Pentagon Papers in the case of Daniel Ellsberg. But as far as the source is concerned, Daniel Ellsberg, in that case, well, he was tried and not, I don't think, imprisoned in the end, but the First Amendment does not protect the source, the whistleblower. There is legislation in the United States that protects the whistleblowers if they use quite specific procedures, and that does not include going to a journalist. It means going to a government agency and disclosing what you consider to be illegal or improper activity. So the First Amendment is good for you all as journalists, but not for the sources.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Pia. So tomorrow there's another panel focusing on the question how to prepare for the AI whistleblowers. I think the hypothesis is there are more big AI companies and it gets harder for journalists to get information because they're also very technical, so they have to rely more on insiders. What's your take on that? Are tech whistleblowers or hackers who provide you or hack tech companies, are they more important to the public?
Wait, can you say that a little again? Are
tech whistleblowers or hackers who hack tech companies, are they in particular important for the public?
I mean, I think that they are, just because the tech companies have such like a overwhelming asymmetric power over everything that happens right now. So I think that they are, because like, you know, like the decisions that Meta makes and the decisions that like Google makes and that Apple makes kind of affect everybody. So yeah, but also you know, I'm a tech person, and so I think that I have like a lot of bias, and I'm interested in this stuff, and I report on what I'm interested in. But yeah, I mean, I think AI is in the middle of changing everything, and I can't wait for the first huge AI data sets and leaks. Yeah, absolutely.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Over here, maybe?
Hi. How concerned are you about the latest in the Assange case? What more do you think we can be doing in light of Biden's comments that they're considering the call to drop the prosecution? Thanks.
Well, I think this prosecution has cast a chill over journalism in terms of what Assange did to obtain the information. I think we have to kind of separate what he did to obtain the information and what he did with the information once he had it, which is more controversial. But the way he obtained the information, as Alex is saying, in some ways it's pretty classic investigative journalism. And that's why this case has cast such a chill. I mean, Biden could have taken steps to end this earlier, but it seems that he is likely to do so before the presidential election. And obviously the case has been on a bit of a very slow track in the UK during the years of his presidency, probably in the expectation that it would eventually be dropped. And so that is, I mean, I have no inside knowledge at all on this, but that is what I would expect to happen before November.
Actually, we have 3 more minutes. Do you want to ask a question?
Thank you. Thanks for the great talk. My name's Ollie. I was wondering about the process of like quality control when you're using a leaked data set. Obviously, when you download a data set from a licit source, like a legal source, you can look at the documentation, and there's like ample evidence that like what you're looking at is accurate, and you can sort of check it against other data sets. A lot of the time when you use leaked data, you can't have reference to external validation. You may have a partial data set, or there may be like non-random missingness in your data set, which may be significant. I was just wondering whether or not that was something that you guys encountered, and how you went about sort of doing quality control on leaked or hacked data sets.
Yeah, so how you go about doing this obviously depends on the data set, and I feel like there's a lot of things that are really difficult to do, like detecting if like a few records have been deleted from the data set, but the rest of it's real. It's really hard to tell that, but I think that the safest way from like a source protection perspective is, if you can, using OSINT to try and corroborate what is in the data set. So it totally depends on the data set, but like a good example is if you have a bunch of emails, emails, in the email headers, there's a header called DCAM, which you could oftentimes use to basically, like if it's an email from a Gmail address, you can cryptographically prove that the Google server actually sent this email. And so that's like one way of doing this. But yeah, any ways that you can use like publicly available information from any source on the internet to match up with what's in your data set, that could raise your confidence that it's real.
I think we're actually out of time. I just want to thank you, the audience, for coming to this. Also the Perugia Journalism Festival for having this kind of panel. And lastly, obviously, our panel here. Please say thank you.